We are here with a rather distinguished panel to discuss reparations. Reparations is a very broad subject, and I think that what we all want to do is when we leave here this evening that we know a bit more than when we first arrived.
Reparatory justice in the context of the enslavement of African peoples in the Caribbean is an old conversation. In the context of the emancipation conversation of the 1820s and 30s, from time to time the question was raised about reparations or compensation for the enslaved peoples.
So Hilary, every point is made, I'm inclined to fully agree with. The significance and the importance of this issue is such, however, I feel before there's closure and certainty as to where it's going in terms of the CARICOM demands, that it is important for us to reflect very seriously and consider very seriously whether this demand for reparation is the appropriate way to go forward. Given the 5 minutes, obviously one can't touch on all of these, but one of my concerns has been the rush towards apology and the demand for apology, not only with respect to reparations, but in a general sense. I think it's become part of the populist ideology overall over the last 10, 15 years or so, for people to issue apologies. I'm
going to begin with kind of two quotes. One is Bell Hooks, who reminds us that we've had a slave's idea of freedom, and to the slave, the master's way of life seems to be the ideal way of life. And the second quote is from a fellow reparationist, Brother Kofi Mawuli-Klue, who says that the best way to make reparations for the past is to make preparations for the future. So reparations is not about the past, it's about the future that we envision. And so what I'm going to share with you in the few minutes that I've got is a vision that is a transgenerational vision from the movement, from our ancestors, because essentially we don't just see reparations as a demand, as a political claim or a legal claim. Reparations is actually about a social movement.
I think we need to come to at least a working understanding of reparations. What outcomes are we looking for? What are we looking for? An apology, as Professor Goldburn said, and that's it? Or are we looking for other outcomes and so on? And I think that before we can do that, really, before we can discuss the way the issues we need.
One of my concerns is to also to promote the idea of slavery as genocide. Fact is that in the case of the Caribbean, 800,000 enslaved African peoples were left at emancipation, but 5 million were brought into the region. And if you bring 5 million people into a region, and after 200 years you're left with 800,000, then clearly I believe there's good ground for that kind of conversation. At emancipation, slave owners argued that a significant section of the enslaved population did not need emancipation because they were comfortable with those arrangements, and they spoke about that in their own language. Emancipation was seen as an imposition upon those peoples in certain spaces. If you fast forward 150 years, and you come to the independence moment, each Caribbean leader in the 1950s and early 60s believed that if they had taken independence to referendum, that the black people in the Caribbean would have voted against independence and would have voted to stay in the colonial arrangement. And this is precisely why no Caribbean leader went to referendum. Each and every single one imposed independence upon the societies without referendum, because they could not trust public opinion. Now, this is very interesting. I suspect that we come now to the reparations issue. Do Caribbean peoples support reparatory justice? If a referendum is taken tomorrow, where would they come down? The fact is that, like independence, like reparations, there's a very wishy-washy understanding of what reparatory justice is all about. There is a general inability to connect the dots between poverty, impoverishment, dispossession, disenfranchisement, ... back to slavery and to the 100 years of apartheid which was put in place after emancipation. And if you consider Jamaica the largest of our society, Britain took control of that society 1655. Jamaica became independent 1962. When Jamaica became independent, 82% of Jamaican people were illiterate. So a black population left illiterate in awful domestic situations in respect of housing, terrible infrastructure, I mean, the most dilapidated urban complex, massive poverty in the rural community. So Jamaica was told, okay, now you're independent, now go and develop. Now, there is no model of development that I have seen or I have read that would have enabled Jamaican people with those variables, with those conditions, to take that absolute mess and convert it into a developmental strategy. And what we have said by way of our contribution is to say to the British state, you have a responsibility to return to the site and participate in the development strategy for these societies that you have extracted the wealth from, that you have left in a state of absolute endemic poverty. Let's participate in the process of development and of infrastructural and human resource development and so on.
I feel that the focus very much on the European states, particularly Britain, leaves out of the question some of what African leaders in the past themselves did in this story of slavery. The second example from the 10 points I would take, which is of concern, I think, is that of repatriation. Now, again, we can have good intentions in terms of resolving certain and righting certain historic wrongs, but also some of these can have unintended consequences. I think of, for example, the founding of Sierra Leone and Liberia. Do we want to have more of these kinds of situations? Or to exaggerate the point further, do we want to establish sort of states of Israel in terms of a return? So what then is the moral basis of the claim? Crime against humanity, and Hilary has set that out very clearly in his writings and certainly in his presentation. But we have to remember that the development of what we call humanity today is something that we ourselves have contributed to massively in terms of our struggles over the last 2 centuries. We describe something called a trade, and a trade suggests that there were several parties, or at least a contract of 2 involved. Rather similar to Marx's theory of exploitation, the laborer selling his labor power to the capitalist. Once that is alienated, that is alienated. So we cannot then simply return back and see this as piracy, or perhaps that is what we want to describe that trade and that experience to have been. So I would want to say that we need the continuation of this discussion, not in terms of rubbishing one side or the other, but really to be able to see that if we come to a closure, to an understanding of these forms of demand, it can be a kind of demand over which most people can agree.
In relation to reparations, we understand that the CARICOM committee have affirmed the Caribbean's argument that the transatlantic slavery and chattel slavery was a crime against humanities, which was also declared by the United Nations. Is that correct?
This is correct. The United Nations conference in Durban made 1 step forward and made 2 steps backwards. The 1 step forward was that slavery and slave trading were in fact crimes against humanity. But it went on to say, and should have always been, even in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. The word should, which was introduced in the resolution, was intended to ensure that we draw a line between the historical transatlantic slave trade and slavery with contemporary slavery. That is to suggest that contemporary slavery is clearly crimes against humanity, historical slavery is not. We challenged that position in Durban then. We did not vote for it as a Caribbean group then. We still maintain it was a crime against humanity, indeed was and still is a crime against humanity, then as is now.
When we ask for reparations, what we're asking for is that we repair that breach. The idea, the notion that black life is cheap. We want to create a world in which African life is precious, nay, priceless.
I found out that one of the most important elements to reparation, and in particular to reparations to African people, is our connection to land. The land issue has to be dealt with, and a people not connected to their land is a powerless people.
Well, basically what I was here was representing the international social movement for African reparations. There are political arguments, many academics, heads of government speaking on this issue. What's missing is a recognition that there's a movement that is bottom up, that is led by the people. And I was here to represent the movement, to give an indication of where the movement's been, what we're seeking, the kind of changes that we want to see, and the kind of strategies that we believe must be implemented if our people are to benefit from a reparatory justice framework. In terms of the movement for reparations, there are two roads that we can take. We've heard about the road of governments and CARICOM in particular, which has brought us all here. But there's another road, and it's a road that has been more travelled, not less travelled. And that is the road of the people. The CARICOM initiative speaks about reparations for African slavery and native genocide. So there's something wrong with the picture when we're not yet creating the mechanism where we can be talking to each other across these geographical regions that have been put there and are actually part of the damage and the harm by separating us as ethnicities, as nationalities, as peoples. For us, we also believe that the strategy must not just be left to British law firms. The people themselves must be engaged in advocacy and defence of their own claim and their own case. And therefore, an approach to social justice lawyering is required, which is where lawyers themselves work in service of the movement and the people themselves. And ultimately, if we're talking about democracy, rule of the people and government of the people, governments themselves must ensure that they are creating the mechanisms so that they can hear the voices of the people. And they must take responsibility if that work is not being done sufficiently well, where the people themselves do not articulate their struggle for repair. But then that brings me to another question of cognitive justice. Our people understand reparations. They may not articulate it in academic terms or legal terms. So we must ensure that we ourselves are not closing down the possibilities because we are refusing to hear the voice of our people. If it were not for them, we would not be here. So finally, I would say where that's leading us to is also looking then about how we connect in the UK. We need to be consulted because many of us are Caribbean nationals. Even if people are from the continent of Africa, it's their family too. We must not keep these borders of separation amongst us. So in the UK, this is where we do have some joining. We are at this stage now where we are seeking to hold this government to account to remind them not only of the historical slavery as genocide, but the continuing genocide.
On the point of governments, I think Esther makes an important point. At Durban in 2001, when the UN brought this process together, the governments of CARICOM did not send prime ministers. In fact, the only Caribbean government that was represented by a head of state in Durban was Cuba. Fidel Castro was the only Caribbean head of state. Almost every government in the region sent lower level representation because the governments were not committed to this process. The governments were not committed. I think where Esther and I have a little interpretive difference is that her argument is correct, but it's the people who have forced the governments into this position. So the people's organizations, when the government saw how strong civil society organizations were in Durban, when the governments of the Caribbean saw the power coming from the grassroots organizations, the governments came on board. So The governments did not start out with a vision. The governments were opposed to it. I would say that almost every single Caribbean government was opposed to engaging the European states in reparatory justice.
When you think about reparations, you have to look at things very logically and say, well, who are you going to sue? Who is the victim? And how much are you going to give them? That's always what we look at. And so the problem for me with I can see legally, I can see morally the problem, and I agree that there's a debt in a sense that's owed, but legally, who do you identify as the victims? Do you identify all the slaves over 200 years of slavery? Do you identify the people who were freed at the moment of abolition? And what about us who are descendants? Or do you identify the people who were captured in Africa and brought across the Atlantic Ocean?
The struggle for reparations is going to require political struggle, political transformation, and that cannot just be looked at in terms of a diplomatic strategy. At some point we may have to take our reparations, which is why the people themselves need to raise their consciousness, their legal consciousness, their political consciousness of where the movement has been, where the movement is now, and where it's projected to go.
I think today's event went quite well. This is the third in our series, and each event has a larger audience than the previous one, so we're very glad at that. One of these days we'll be profitable and you'll say, well, we've actually made some money on the basis of this event. But we like to identify topics that are controversial and are interesting to the diaspora or to people who might want to invest. We've got lots of things in the pipeline. One might be something like the criminal justice system here in the UK, how does it affect black people? Another might be technology in the Caribbean, how do we develop the Caribbean economy? And how do we use technology to advance development? So lots of ideas. The problem is engaging speakers and putting them together in a meaningful way that will attract an audience.
Thanks to our impressive panel, Professor Goldburn, to Esther Stamford-Exosi, and to Professor Sir Hilary. And thank you most of all for attending and participating.